You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I was never really a runner. The way I see running is a gift, especially when you have stage 4 cancer. I'm Anne. I'm running the Boston Marathon, presented by Bank of America. I run for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to give people like me a chance to thrive in life, even with cancer.
Join Bank of America in helping Anne's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportAnne. What would you like the power to do? References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation. Copyright 2025.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 489 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, we've been looking at the collapse of Grant's peripheral strategy in Virginia in the spring of 1864. With the last episode, we talked about the Battle of New Market, which took place in the Shenandoah Valley on May 15, 1864, and resulted in a victory by John C. Breckinridge's Confederates over the Federal force led by Franz Sigel.
Breckinridge's victory at New Market allowed him to send 2,500 priceless reinforcements to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which was locked in a fierce struggle with the Army of the Potomac. At the end of the last episode, we said that far to the east of the Shenandoah Valley, on May 15th, the same day the Battle of New Market was fought, Private John W. Joyce, serving in the 21st North Carolina, wrote to his wife, quote, "The Yankees are pouring in like flies. We passed through Richmond day before yesterday, and they are in the greatest excitement in Richmond I ever seed in my life. They are scared nearly to death. The Yankees are doing a heap of mischief wherever they go."
Joyce wrote that letter to his wife while he was at Drury's Bluff, a Confederate defensive bastion on the James River below Richmond. The excitement he described stemmed from two sources. First, Benjamin Butler's Federal Army of the James, which had landed at Bermuda Hundred and was now threatening both Richmond and the rail hub of Petersburg, and second, a strong Union cavalry raid, 10,000 troopers strong, led by Phil Sheridan, which had come within a few miles of the rebel capital.
The peril posed by Butler and Sheridan, who threatened the Confederate capital from opposite directions, placed Richmond in its greatest jeopardy since June 1862, when George McClellan had brought the Army of the Potomac within 5 miles of the city. Now, in the spring of 1864, Butler showed up first, landing at Bermuda Hundred on May 5th, but it was Sheridan who moved faster, reached Richmond's outskirts sooner, and so was the first of the two Federal threats to culminate.
Sheridan's cavalry raid, of course, had its genesis in the May 8th confrontation between George Meade and Little Phil, when the two generals raged at one another about the performance of the Union cavalry up to that point in the Wilderness Campaign.
As you'll recall, Sheridan declared he could whip Jeb Stuart if Meade would only give him the chance. And Meade, prodded by Ulysses S. Grant, issued the order that gave Sheridan his chance. And Little Phil wasted no time assembling his division commanders, David McMurtry Gregg, Wesley Merritt, and James H. Wilson, and announcing, "We are going out to fight Stuart's cavalry in consequence of a suggestion from me. In view of my recent representations to Meade, I shall expect nothing but success."
Gregg, Merritt, and Wilson were surprised by Sheridan's announcement, but they quickly warmed to the idea and listened closely as Little Phil outlined his plan. The Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps set out at daybreak the very next morning, May 9th.
When the Federal horsemen set out on the morning of May 9th, they left behind the infantry battle still brewing around Spotsylvania and headed east toward the Telegraph Road, the main highway between Fredericksburg and Richmond.
The force under Sheridan's command moved at a walk in one immense 13-mile column consisting of 7 brigades of horsemen and 2 of horse artillery, together with ambulances and supply and ammunition wagons. In all, it was about 12,000 men and 32 guns. The force had one objective: to fight the rebel cavalry wherever it might be found.
Sheridan made no attempt to conceal this movement, and so Confederate scouts detected it almost at once. Given the strength of the Federal column, it would have made sense for Jeb Stuart to set out to confront it with every trooper available to him, but instead he left 4 of his 7 brigades behind. Possibly at his own initiative, possibly at the insistence of Robert E. Lee, who couldn't afford the absence of most of the rebel cavalry at a time when Grant was likely to try and slip around his flank.
The 2 brigades of rebel horsemen in Fitz Lee's division galloped after Sheridan around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 9th. A 3rd brigade, under James Gordon, departed later. Stuart himself left the army around 3 p.m. and after a 4-hour ride caught up with Fitz Lee about 20 miles south of Spotsylvania at the tiny hamlet of Mitchell's Shop. Gordon's brigade arrived there shortly after nightfall.
Fitz Lee told Stuart that his troopers had clashed with Sheridan's rear guard on 2 occasions, the second time right there at Mitchell's Shop. Given the Yankee column's superior numbers, there had been no question of Lee stopping the enemy or even slowing him down. As a result, the head of Sheridan's column was already at the North Anna River, nearly halfway to Richmond.
Anxious to get ahead of the Yankees, Jeb Stuart ordered a night march. Fitz Lee would take one of his brigades, William Wickham's, and continue straight after the Federals. Stuart would take Gordon and also Lee's 2nd Brigade, Lunsford Lomax's, swing to the west, cross the North Anna upstream, and try to hit Sheridan while his column was astride the river and vulnerable.
But Stuart's gamble failed. Anticipating just such a move, Sheridan sent a detachment to guard against it and got the rest of his cavalry safely across the North Anna before the Confederates could lay a glove on him. Instead, Stuart encountered only the wreckage of the supply depot at Beaver Dam Station on the Virginia Central Railroad just south of the North Anna River. Federal horsemen had hit the depot, destroyed 2 locomotives, burnt 100 rail cars, a store of medical supplies, and 1.5 million rations of meat and bread. They also liberated between 300 and 400 prisoners of war who had been captured recently at the Wilderness and at Laurel Hill.
Jeb Stuart now issued new orders. The enemy had chopped down trees across the road as they moved south, making direct pursuit difficult. Therefore, only Gordon would follow the Federal column, maintain contact, and make certain Sheridan didn't double back and strike the Army of Northern Virginia from behind.
Meanwhile, Fitz Lee's 2 brigades would ride southeast until they reached the Telegraph Road and use it in an attempt to overtake the Yankees before they reached Richmond. Stuart fired off a stream of dispatches, warning the rebel capital of Sheridan's approach and stating, "Should he attack Richmond, I will certainly move in his rear and do what I can. At the same time, I hope to be able to strike him if he endeavors to escape."
The Confederate horsemen stayed in the saddle all day and well into the evening. Finally, at around 9 p.m. on the 10th, they halted at Taylorsville, just south of Hanover Junction. By then, the rebel troopers had been in the saddle for 32 hours and desperately needed rest, but Stuart gave them just 6 hours. At 3 o'clock on the morning of May 11th, the weary men and animals were underway again, and Stuart swore he'd overtake Sheridan if it cost every horse in his command.
But such desperate oaths were unnecessary. since Sheridan actually had little interest in reaching Richmond ahead of his adversary. Instead, Little Phil's aim was to battle the Confederate cavalry and whip Jeb Stuart. Therefore, since there was no need to maintain a frantic pace, Sheridan ordered a halt at 4:15 on the afternoon of the 10th, and the Union horsemen went into bivouac just across the Ground Squirrel Bridge on the South Anna River.
Meanwhile, Jeb Stuart was thinking that Sheridan was keeping up a pace as killing as his own. In fact, he wrote to Robert E. Lee that he hoped, quote, "the enemy's horses are broken down," end quote. Yet it was Stuart and his men who fell asleep on the night of May 10th in a state of exhaustion, while Phil Sheridan felt fresh enough to play with the children of the household where he made his headquarters that evening.
Wednesday, May 11th, dawned bright and mild, promising a lovely start to the spring day. At Ground Squirrel Bridge, bugles sounded to horse, and 10,000 Union cavalrymen swung into the saddle and rode off toward Richmond, leaving a brigade of 2,000 troopers under John Irvin Gregg behind to guard the column's rear. And by the way, Brigade Commander John Irvin Gregg was Division Commander David McMurtry Gregg's cousin.
The troopers who stayed behind figured they drew an easy assignment, since the bridge had burned and the rebels would have a hard time reaching them. Instead, much to their surprise, Gordon's brigade of Confederate horsemen came barreling down upon them, having splashed across the South Anna at an old ford nearby.
For the next several hours, Gregg's brigade and Gordon's rebels carried on a running fight as Gregg attempted to shield the rear of Sheridan's column, while Gordon attacked ferociously, attempting to break through the Yankee rear guard. Though Gregg managed to fend off the Confederates, the effort was costly.
A second sharp encounter occurred near Ashland when another Federal brigade under Henry Davies showed up to destroy the tracks of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Fitz-Lee's rebel cavalry put a stop to that, but not before Davies' Yankees had done significant damage.
Meanwhile, Sheridan's main column was advancing on the Mountain Road, the main highway from Richmond to Charlottesville. Jeb Stuart, riding with Fitz-Lee's division, was coming down the Telegraph Road. The two roads intersected near an old inn called Yellow Tavern, which was yellow only in memory now, since it was long abandoned. It was at Yellow Tavern that Jeb Stuart planned to have his decisive encounter with the Yankee cavalry threatening Richmond.
Lomax's brigade reached Yellow Tavern first, comfortably ahead of the Federals. It was 8 o'clock on the morning of the 11th when Lomax established a blocking position at the crossroads.
Wickham's brigade arrived a short time later, along with Fitz-Lee and Jeb Stuart. Having beat the Yankees to Yellow Tavern, Stuart now had 3 options available to him. He could withdraw into Richmond's defenses, the outer ring of which was barely 2 miles to the south.
He could strengthen Lomax's position at the crossroads, there directly across the path of the Federals.
Or he could deploy his troopers nearby so as to ambush the Yankees and hit them in the flank as they rode by. Well, Stuart rejected the first option and combined the other two. Lomax assumed a position on the Telegraph Road, just short of the intersection, with skirmishers thrown forward in the direction of the mountain road. Wickham's brigade deployed on a low ridge that overlooked a tiny stream called Turner's Run. That spot was about a half-mile to the north of Lomax's position, and it faced south, thus enabling Wickham's men to hit the Federal flank and rear if the Yankees tried to simply bowl their way past.
With only 3,000 troopers immediately on hand to stop Sheridan, Jeb Stuart reckoned the odds to be about 3-1 against him, although in reality they were a bit worse than that. Nevertheless, he hoped not only to halt the Yankee column, but to destroy it.
Obviously, his own command was insufficient to do the job on its own. But if a sizable number of soldiers from the Richmond garrison came out and helped in the fight, then the rebel cavalry was well placed to cut off Sheridan's only line of retreat. Stuart had kept the War Department well informed about not only Sheridan's approach, but his own strength and situation, so he assumed the authorities would send him help. However, to make certain, Stuart sent a trusted staff officer, Major H.B. McClellan, to locate General Braxton Bragg, Jefferson Davis's military advisor, and get Bragg's assurance.
But long before McClellan could return, the 1st Union Cavalry pounded up, a full division under Wesley Merritt. The Federals dismounted, formed line of battle, and crossed a field of new corn. Their 7-shot breech-loading Spencer carbines barked relentlessly.
Merritt's Federals slammed into Lomax's Confederates, captured 200 of them, and sent the rest flying to the north to join Wickham's line on the ridge. Jeb Stuart nevertheless expressed satisfaction with the outcome. He had halted Sheridan's progress. He still held the ground that commanded the Federals' line of retreat, and Sheridan was deep in hostile country, whereas Stuart's men stood not 10 miles from the city center of Richmond.
The possibility of a foray by the city's garrison loomed as large in Phil Sheridan's mind as it did in Jeb Stuart's, and as the initial fighting subsided, he sent 2 regiments and a section of artillery toward Richmond to see what they could discover.
They headed down the Brook Turnpike, past the unmanned outer defensive works, and got close enough to the city to hear the peal of bells, the whistle of locomotives, and other indications that, quote, general alarm and bustling seemed to prevail in Richmond.
But there was no sign the city garrison was getting ready to march forth and help the rebel cavalry, and Sheridan, hearing this welcome news, knew he could wait for his other 2 divisions to arrive on the scene. Then, as advertised, he would whip Jeb Stuart out of his boots.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
On the ridgeline to the north of the Yellow Tavern crossroads, Jeb Stuart was entertaining thoughts of whipping Phil Sheridan out of his boots. A courier arrived with word that Gordon had driven the Union cavalry's rear guard from Ground Squirrel Bridge, and Stuart boomed joyously, "Bully for Gordon!"
At 2 p.m., McClellan returned from his ride into Richmond to seek out Braxton Bragg. Bragg had told him that while at the moment the Richmond defenses were manned only by 4,000 reservists and government clerks, there were 3 full brigades of veteran Confederate infantry on their way to the capital from Petersburg.
Stuart liked the sound of that. McClellan recalled, quote, "He was pleased with the information I had brought from Richmond and expressed the intention of retaining his position on Sheridan's flank and the hope that, aided by a strong attack by the infantry in Richmond, he might be able to inflict serious disaster on the enemy cavalry."
Jeb Stuart sent a note to Bragg requesting that one of the 3 brigades on its way to Richmond from Petersburg, a Virginia brigade led by Eppa Hunton, should be sent out against Sheridan's right flank. He wrote, "If we make a combined attack on them, I cannot see how they can escape."
The day had started to darken with the clouds of an approaching afternoon thunderstorm when Stuart's bright vision of triumph was shattered when Little Phil attacked at 4 p.m. with 3 massed divisions of Federal horsemen. Hunton and the rebel infantry hadn't shown up, nor had Gordon after hounding the Yankee rear guard, so Jeb Stuart had only Fitz Lee's 2 brigades, which were arrayed on the ridgeline above Turner's Run. But, game as ever, the Confederate Cavalier opened fire on the Yankees with his artillery. At almost the same moment, the skies opened, drenching the combatants. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled above the sound of the guns.
The Federals and Confederates hacked and clawed at one another, with most regiments fighting dismounted, but a few on horseback. It was over within 30 minutes. The Federals simply had too many men, and their attack was too strong.
Sheridan didn't even have his whole command engaged when the Confederate line cracked and the survivors withdrew to safety beyond the Chickahominy River some 2 miles to the east. The officer who led the rebel retreat was Fitz Lee, not Jeb Stuart. While driving back a Federal thrust at the center of his line, exhorting his men, blazing away with his Lamat revolvers, defiantly on horseback, Stuart had been gut shot by a Michigan private named John Huff.
Jeb Stuart had received hardly a scratch in 3 years of war, but now he slumped in the saddle as blood poured from his awful wound and mingled with the spring rain. When Fitz Lee rode up, his face etched with concern, Stuart told him, "Go ahead, Fitz, old fellow. I know you'll do what's right."
That night, Sheridan triumphantly held the field of what Jeb Stuart had imagined would be the scene of his own victory. Instead, the beaten Confederate horsemen made a cheerless bivouac in the rain, even as an ambulance rattled along the muddy roads on a 6-hour-long roundabout trek to Richmond. It finally halted in front of a handsome residence on Gracie Street, the home of Stuart's brother-in-law, Dr. Charles Brewer.
Grief-stricken aides carried Stuart inside to his deathbed. In great pain, he lingered another day, struggling to stay alive long enough for his wife, Flora, to reach him. Gradually, though, it became clear that this would never happen. Wavering between hope and resignation, he said, "I am resigned if it be God's will, but I would like to see my wife. But God's will be done."
A little after 7 o'clock on the evening of May 12th, 2 clergymen were brought to his bedside. Stuart, always fond of singing, asked them to join him in a rendition of his favorite hymn, Rock of Ages. The 3 men sang the old anthem, "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." James Ewell Brown Stuart, unable to fend off death any longer, passed at 7:38. Flora didn't arrive until shortly before midnight.
While Jeb Stuart lay dying, Phil Sheridan collected his wounded and continued his march, leaving Yellow Tavern around 11 p.m., skirting Richmond to the north and east, and heading to link up with Butler's Army of the James.
However, Little Phil soon realized he couldn't squeeze between the city's outer defenses and the rain-swollen Chickahominy River, so he'd have to cross the river and bypass Richmond well to the east. That meant gaining control of the Meadow Bridges just northeast of the city, which in turn meant fighting off Fitz Lee's Confederate cavalry, which held the opposite bank.
The Meadow Bridges themselves were in a state of partial collapse and would have to be repaired. To do so would require the Federals to drive away the rebels after crossing the river by the only available means, the Virginia Central Railroad bridge that crossed the Chickahominy a short distance to the east.
As dismounted Yankees carefully made their way across the railroad bridge, Gordon's rebel horsemen pressed in from the west, while a veteran Confederate infantry brigade, led by Archibald Gracie, advanced from Richmond. One Union officer admitted, quote, "It was the tightest place in which the cavalry corps ever found itself."
Sheridan seemed not to care. He soon had troopers in action in all directions, against Fitz Lee, against Gordon, against Gracie, and to an anxious artilleryman he laughingly declared, "Why, what do you suppose we have in front of us? A lot of clerks from Richmond who have been forced into ranks."
Sheridan boasted that far from being caught in a tight spot, he could ride right into Richmond if he wanted. However, quote, "It isn't worth the men it would cost, but I'll stay here all day to show those fellows how much I care for them, and go when I get ready."
And so the Federal horsemen stood their ground, taking on all comers, knocking them back, and taking their sweet time in leaving. Finally, at around 4 o'clock on the afternoon of May 12th, the meadow bridges were clear of the enemy and repaired. The Union cavalry crossed the river, and the Confederates had suffered a second defeat in as many days.
The Federal cavalry then made its leisurely way to Hacksaw's Landing, far below Richmond on the James River, where it encamped on the 14th. Sheridan established contact with Union gunboats and sent a message to Ulysses S. Grant detailing his success. Sheridan believed he'd convincingly demonstrated that the Confederates could not stop him, and near the end of the message he wrote, "If I could be permitted to cross the James River and go southward, I could almost ruin the Confederacy."
Sheridan's raid had cost the Federals about 600 casualties, and the Confederates roughly the same, as well as the severe material losses inflicted at Beaver Dam Station and much temporary damage to the railroads. The hardest blow, of course, was the death of Jeb Stuart.
The Confederate public greeted the news with shock, and rebel cavalrymen still on duty with the army at Spotsylvania, quote, "bowed their heads and wept like children." Robert E. Lee got word of Stuart's mortal wound on May 12th as he struggled to construct a new line across the base of the Muleshoe. In shaken tones, he told his staff what had happened, then added by way of tribute, "He never brought me a piece of false information." With Sigel's defeat at Newmarket out in the Shenandoah Valley and the end of Sheridan's cavalry raid, we have just one more aspect of Grant's peripheral strategy to discuss: Benjamin Butler's Army of the James, which was firmly established at Bermuda Hundred and threatening Richmond from the south. But as we'll see in the next show, that threat lasted scarcely longer before it too was neutralized in one of the Civil War's most curious operations.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Jeb Stuart, The Soldier and the Man by Edward G. Longacre. Longacre is a prolific author of Civil War books, including a number of other biographies of cavalry commanders. Here, he tackled Jeb Stuart, and this just came out last year. And surprisingly, it's the first major Stuart biography to come out in about 15 years. You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website is info on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon, just like Matt B., Keedet, Adam, Bob E., and Tyler B. have all done recently. A few days ago, we released members episode number 159, so we hope everyone in the Strawfoot Brigade has enjoyed listening to that. Thanks to those new members. And thanks also, as always, to Spiritwood Music for permission to use their song Midnight on the Water as the music you hear at the beginning and at the end of each episode of the podcast.
All right, and thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.